Hey everyone, welcome back to the Horror Stories. I know a lot of you enjoy these videos to relax before falling into a deep sleep. So before that moment arrives, leave a comment and let me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the content, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really gives me the motivation to bring you more chilling stories. Now, settle in, relax, and let's begin tonight's eerie tale. Ria was one of the few brave souls who preferred the quiet of the night. She'd worked the shift for months, her desk a familiar refuge amidst the glow of screens and the distant echoes of colleagues on the other side of the room. But lately, an unsettling chill had begun to seep into her routine. It started subtly, an odd flicker of the fluorescent lights above, a fleeting shadow at the edge of her vision that vanished when she turned her head. One evening, as Ria adjusted her headset and prepared for another round of calls, she noticed a cold spot near her desk, a sharp contrast to the warm, buzzing air around her. It felt like stepping into a different world, one where the normal rules of the office were suspended. The sensation sent a shiver down her spine, but she brushed it off, convincing herself it was just the late hour playing tricks on her. As the clock ticked past midnight, her phone rang, the screen displaying an unknown number. She answered, and the line crackled with static, a ghostly echo that seemed to ripple through the silence of the call center. "Hello? Is anyone there?" Ria asked, her voice trembling slightly. There was no response, just the sound of her own breath mixed with the unsettling static. She hung up, her heart racing. The calls continued night after night, each one more eerie than the last. She'd hear whispers that sent a chill through her bones, words she couldn't quite decipher, fading in and out like the static on the line. One night, as she sat with her headphones on, she caught sight of a shadow moving along the wall, stretching and bending in unnatural ways. Ria blinked hard, trying to convince herself it was a trick of the light, but deep down, a seed of dread began to sprout. As the nights rolled on, the cold spots multiplied, creeping closer to her desk, while the whispers morphed into haunting wails that echoed in her mind. She began to piece together fragments of an old legend, a tale whispered among the locals about spirits that haunted places of business after dark. They were said to be the restless souls of employees who had met untimely ends, trapped in a loop of unfulfilled work and sorrow. Desperate to find answers, Ria dug deeper into the stories that circulated among her colleagues. One evening, she cornered an older employee who had worked there long enough to know the whispers. "They say if you hear the calls, it's a warning," he told her, his voice low and trembling. "The spirits want something. They don't like being disturbed." Ria's heart raced. It was not just her imagination. She was being drawn into something far more sinister than she had anticipated. That night, she resolved to confront the presence that haunted her. As the clock struck 3, she gathered her courage and sat in silence, the hum of the call center replaced by an oppressive stillness. The phone rang again, the familiar unknown number flashing on the screen. She answered, ready to face whatever awaited her on the other end. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice echoing in the hollow darkness. The static faded, and for a moment there was silence. Then a voice emerged, chilling and distant. "Help us." The words sent her spiraling. Suddenly, the cold spots surged around her, the shadows morphing into shapes that loomed larger and closer. Ria realized with a gut-wrenching twist that she was not merely hearing the calls. She was being summoned. The spirits were reaching out, desperate for release. With newfound resolve, Ria began to speak, her voice strong against the static. "I will help you. I promise." As she spoke, the shadows began to retreat, their forms dissolving into the dim light of the call center. The air grew warmer, and the oppressive weight lifted. The calls stopped that night, but the legend of the restless spirits remained etched in her mind. From that day on, Ria approached her night shifts with a mixture of caution and respect. She understood now that the call center was not just a workplace. It was a crossroads between the living and the departed. And as she sat at her desk, she could still feel the faint whispers lingering in the air, a reminder of the shadows that danced just out of sight, waiting for someone to hear their story. Days turned into weeks, and the call center continued its relentless rhythm, the cacophony of ringing phones and chatter a constant backdrop to Ria's life. Yet, despite the calm that had settled after her encounter with the spirits, an unsettling feeling lingered. She could still sense the presence of those restless souls, a weight that hovered in the corners of her mind. As she worked her shifts, Ria began to notice subtle changes around her. Fellow employees who once laughed and joked in the break room now spoke in hushed tones, glancing nervously at their phones whenever the static-laden calls came through. It was as if everyone could feel the undercurrent of something supernatural, a shared unease that created a tight-knit web of fear. One evening, during a particularly quiet stretch, Ria received an email from an unknown sender. The subject line simply read, "Help." Curiosity piqued. She opened it, revealing a string of unsettling images. Photos of her desk taken at odd angles, shadows creeping into the frame, and faint silhouettes lurking in the background. The final image froze her blood, a close-up of her chair, empty, with a shadow draped over it, darker than the surrounding night. Heart racing, Ria glanced around her workspace, the faint glow of her monitor illuminating her surroundings. The air felt thicker, more oppressive. She quickly checked the call logs, and her heart sank. She had received multiple calls from that same unknown number, all during the times she had been in the office alone. That night, emboldened by the knowledge she had gained, Ria decided to confront the spirits again. She knew they were trying to communicate something important. She set up her desk in a way that invited the unknown. A small offering of flowers from the nearby market, a cup of water, and a candle that flickered in the dim light. As the hour grew late, she waited, heart pounding, her eyes scanning the darkness around her. The familiar ring broke the stillness, and she answered, her voice steady. "I'm here. What do you need from me?" The line crackled, and a voice, weak and trembling, emerged. "Release us." Ria felt her throat constrict as she listened. "How?" she asked, desperation coloring her voice. "What do you want me to do?" A pause hung in the air, and she felt the temperature drop sharply. "Find the place." With each word, she felt the shadows deepen around her. Ria understood then that she had to investigate further, to dig into the history of the call center. The spirits were tied to something, perhaps an event long forgotten that had left a scar on this place. The following days were a whirlwind of research. She delved into archives, interviewed old employees, and even visited local historians. Piece by piece, she uncovered a dark history of the building, a tragic accident that had claimed the lives of several workers during its construction decades ago. They had been trapped, a series of mistakes and miscommunication leading to a terrible collapse. Their cries for help swallowed by the dust of the past. Armed with this knowledge, Ria returned to the call center one fateful night, determined to honor the spirits. She gathered her coworkers, sharing the story and inviting them to participate in a small ritual of remembrance. Together, they lit candles and shared their own experiences, allowing the spirit stories to surface, their voices weaving through the air. As they stood together, Ria felt the atmosphere shift. The cold spots began to dissipate, and for the first time, she sensed a warmth enveloping the room. The oppressive weight that had hung over them lifted, replaced by a sense of peace. Then, as the candles flickered, the lights overhead dimmed, and a gentle breeze swept through the room, carrying whispers of gratitude. "Thank you," the voice echoed, sounding clearer than ever. The energy in the space transformed, resonating with a softness that wrapped around them like a protective blanket. The unknown calls ceased that night, and the oppressive shadows melted away. Ria realized that the spirits had found their voice, and in honoring their memory, she had helped them find release. From that day forward, the call center became a place not just of work, but of remembrance. Ria and her colleagues continued to hold small gatherings, celebrating the lives of those lost and sharing stories, ensuring the spirits would never be forgotten again. And as Ria walked through the halls, she felt a sense of calm, knowing that the shadows no longer lurked to haunt, but rather to watch over, a gentle reminder of the fragility of life and the power of connection, even in the darkest of places. With the shadows now a distant memory, the call center felt transformed. Employees chatted more freely, laughter echoed through the halls, and the atmosphere grew lighter. Ria, though still haunted by the past, found solace in the rituals they had established. Every week, they set aside time to remember those who had come before, lighting candles and sharing stories, creating a tapestry of life that honored the lost. But as weeks turned into months, Ria noticed an odd phenomenon. Although the restless energy had dissipated, strange occurrences began to surface. Objects moving slightly out of place, whispers of laughter echoing where no one stood, and the flickering lights that occasionally buzzed to life with no apparent cause. At first, it was dismissed as mere coincidence, but Ria couldn't shake the feeling that something more was at play. One particularly quiet night, as Ria worked late, she felt an urge to investigate further. The call center was empty except for her, and the silence felt oppressive. She decided to explore the basement, a rarely visited area rumored to hold remnants of the building's past. Armed with only a flashlight, she descended the narrow staircase, the air growing cooler with each step. The basement was dimly lit, with boxes stacked high and dust swirling in the beam of her flashlight. As she moved deeper into the space, a sense of déjà vu washed over her. The shadows here felt different, almost playful, as if they recognized her presence. Ria carefully stepped around boxes, her breath echoing softly. In the far corner, she stumbled upon an old filing cabinet, half open, papers spilling out like forgotten memories. As she sifted through the documents, one caught her eye, a faded photograph of the construction crew from decades ago. Faces stared back at her, some smiling, others serious, but all vibrant with life. Her heart raced as she spotted a familiar face, a young man who resembled the whispers she had heard on the phone. Suddenly, the air shifted. A cold breeze swept through the basement, rustling the papers around her. Ria froze, the hair on the back of her neck standing up. The flashlight flickered, and she felt an overwhelming presence surround her, a chorus of voices rising and falling in the silence. "Help us. Remember," they seemed to plead. Ria took a deep breath, grounding herself. "I'm here," she whispered, feeling a connection to them, a thread woven through time. "What do you want me to do?" The shadows shifted again, and in that moment, Ria understood. It wasn't enough to simply remember them. They wanted their story told, to be acknowledged in a way that transcended the mundane. The call center was a business, but it could also be a monument, a place where their legacy lived on, not just in whispered tales, but in the hearts of those who worked there. Determined, Ria returned to her desk and drafted a proposal. She envisioned a memorial wall in the break room, adorned with the faces of the lost, accompanied by stories and memories shared by employees. It would serve as a constant reminder of their presence, celebrating the lives that once filled the building with laughter and camaraderie. As she shared her idea with her colleagues, a wave of enthusiasm swept through the team. They collaborated, collecting stories and photographs, engaging in conversations that sparked laughter and tears. The project grew, transforming into a community effort that brought them all closer together, reinforcing their bond and honoring the past. When the memorial wall was finally unveiled, Ria stood before it, heart swelling with pride. The space was filled with love, warmth, and a sense of belonging. Each photograph and story resonated, allowing the spirits to reclaim their voices. That night, as Ria locked up the call center, she felt a familiar presence, but this time it was gentle, reassuring. The air was lighter, filled with a sense of gratitude. She glanced back at the memorial wall, where the candle she had lit flickered softly, illuminating the names and faces that now belonged to everyone in the building. From then on, Ria no longer felt the chill of shadows or the weight of sorrow. Instead, she carried with her the stories of those who had come before, a connection that bridged the past and the present. And in the quiet moments, when the night shift felt long and lonely, she would whisper her thanks to the spirits who had taught her the true meaning of remembrance, love, and the enduring power of connection in even the darkest places. I had worked the night shift at the warehouse for 6 months now, in a sprawling industrial district on the outskirts of Johannesburg. The pay was decent, and the work wasn't hard, mostly logging inventory and checking that the few machines left on overnight were running smoothly. What I didn't mind at first was the emptiness. There's a strange comfort in being alone in a vast, silent place, knowing the city outside is still bustling, but you're secluded from it all. Over time, though, The warehouse's stillness became more oppressive, and I began to dread the long hours between dusk and dawn. I was halfway through another quiet night. The huge, empty shelves stretched out like metal skeletons in the dim light from the few working bulbs above. I usually kept the lights on, but in certain areas, they'd start to flicker, as if something was interfering with them. It was probably just faulty wiring, I told myself. I had no reason to believe otherwise. But tonight felt different. The air was thick with a stillness I couldn't place. Even the hum of the machines seemed distant, muffled somehow, as though the space had absorbed all sound. And then, I noticed it. A sensation like someone, or something, was watching me. I couldn't shake the feeling. It had been there for days, a nagging discomfort just out of reach, but tonight it was stronger, unavoidable. I stood still for a moment, ears straining for any sound that would explain this unease. And that's when I heard it. Faint at first, like the padding of soft feet on the cold, concrete floor. Footsteps. But they weren't in a rhythm that made sense. Not the even pace of a person walking, but more like the irregular scuffle of something else. Something that didn't move like it belonged in a human body. They seemed to echo from deep within the warehouse, in the unlit areas far beyond where I was standing. I swallowed hard and turned back to the row of shelves I had been checking inventory on, trying to shake the growing discomfort. It was probably just my imagination, I thought. This place was old, and old buildings make noise. Metal groans as it cools, machines click as they reset. But when the sound came again, closer this time, my throat went dry. I turned around slowly, peering into the dark aisle behind me. Nothing. Only shadows. But the feeling of being watched intensified. I shook my head and tried to laugh at myself. "You're being paranoid," I muttered, forcing a smile as I checked my phone for the time. Just a few more hours. But the seconds dragged. The sound of footsteps stopped. For a while there was only silence, thick and suffocating, until I heard something else. Whispers. At first it was so faint I thought it was my own breath, but it was there. Soft, unintelligible, like someone was speaking just on the edge of my hearing, but not to me. More like someone was talking to themselves, or worse, to something else. I froze, trying to pinpoint the direction. The whispering seemed to move, shifting around me in the shadows. Fear began to coil tightly in my chest. It couldn't be the wind, not inside. It wasn't the pipes either. It was voices, and there was no denying that now. It felt like a weight pressing down on me, an invisible presence closing in from all sides. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, drowning out everything else. I grabbed my flashlight from the desk, turning it on with shaking hands. The narrow beam cut through the darkness, but it did little to comfort me. The light seemed to bend and warp around the shelves, revealing nothing but amplifying the sense that something was hiding just beyond its reach. That's when I remembered the stories. The ones my grandmother used to tell me when I was little about the tokolosh. She used to warn us kids, late at night, not to stay out too long or misbehave, or the tokoloshi would come for us. I never believed those tales, but standing here with the whispers growing louder and the darkness creeping in around me, I started to think of them. In South African folklore, the tokoloshi was a small, malevolent creature, mischievous and dangerous. It was said to slip into homes and create havoc, sometimes attacking people in their sleep, choking them or worse. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. It was just folklore, I reminded myself. Just stories told to scare kids. But there was something about the warehouse tonight that made the stories seem more real than they ever had before. I took a deep breath and stepped forward, shining my flashlight down the nearest aisle. "Hello?" My voice was barely a whisper, but it felt like a shout in the oppressive silence. No response. I moved slowly, my footsteps unnaturally loud against the concrete floor. I scanned every corner of the room, every shadow, but there was nothing, just more silence. Then, just as I was about to convince myself it was all in my head, I felt a cold gust of air brush past me, so cold it seemed to burn my skin. My heart leapt into my throat. I swung the flashlight around wildly, the beam bouncing off the metal shelves and crates, but I saw nothing. No open doors, no windows that could have let in the draft. The whispers stopped, but then something worse replaced them, a laugh. Low and guttural, like the sound of something mocking me. My body stiffened, muscles locking up as every primal instinct screamed at me to run. But I was rooted to the spot, my legs refusing to move. I stared into the darkness, my flashlight shaking in my hand. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of movement. A shadow darting between the shelves, too quick and too small to be human. My blood ran cold as I swung the light in its direction, but whatever it was had already disappeared. I stood there, frozen, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. It couldn't have been a person. It moved too fast, and it was too small. But what else could it be? I started backing away slowly, my flashlight still trained on the spot where the shadow had been. Another laugh echoed through the warehouse, this time closer, and I heard the scuffle of feet again. But this time, they were unmistakably real. Slow, deliberate steps that seemed to circle around me. The tokoloshe. The word repeated in my head over and over, and with each repetition, the sense of dread grew. I turned, heart pounding, and ran. My flashlight bounced wildly as I sprinted down the aisles, the sound of footsteps close behind me. The whispers returned, louder now, almost deafening, as though they were coming from every direction. I didn't dare look back. I just ran, the panic rising in my chest like a living thing. I knew I couldn't stay here. Reaching the far end of the warehouse, I slammed into the emergency exit and shoved it open, stumbling out into the cool night air. I didn't stop running until I was halfway across the parking lot, my chest heaving, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I stopped and turned around, staring at the warehouse, now silent and still. But I knew something had followed me, something from the dark. I could still feel its eyes on me, watching from the shadows, waiting. I left my shift early that night, not bothering to clock out. I never went back to the warehouse. When I tried to explain to my boss, he just shook his head, muttering something about the place being cursed. Maybe he knew more than he let on. All I knew was that the tokoloshe wasn't just a story. It was real. And it was still out there, lurking in the dark corners of Johannesburg, waiting for its next victim. I never imagined that taking a night shift at the museum would turn my life upside down. It was supposed to be an easy job, quiet, undemanding. The Egyptian Museum in Cairo was one of the world's most renowned institutions, housing artifacts that had withstood the passage of millennia. To be honest, I saw it as a good way to make some extra money, and the idea of working among Egypt's ancient treasures had a certain allure. It was a far cry from the busy, noisy life outside, in the chaotic streets of Cairo. But nothing could have prepared me for what I would experience once the sun dipped below the horizon, and the museum became a different world. At first, the shifts were simple. I walked the vast, echoing halls, checking the exhibits, making sure everything was in order. The museum was large but dimly lit after hours, with only a few soft lamps illuminating the exhibits. I had always been fascinated by ancient Egypt, its vast history, its mysteries, the legends of the pharaohs, and their immense power. But as much as I respected the culture, I wasn't superstitious. All those tales about curses and ancient spirits haunting tombs seemed like the stuff of horror movies, far removed from reality. That was before things started to happen. Strange things. It began subtly, so much so that I barely noticed at first. One night, as I was making my rounds near the pharaonic hall, where the sarcophagi and mummies were displayed, I thought I heard something. It wasn't the usual creaking of the floorboards or the distant hum of the building settling. This was different, more like a faint rustling, almost like fabric brushing against stone. I paused, shining my flashlight into the room. My heart beat a little faster, but the beam of light revealed nothing out of the ordinary. The mummies were still there, wrapped in their ancient linen, encased behind the thick glass of their displays. I brushed it off as my imagination. After all, it was late, and the museum at night had a way of playing tricks on your mind. The silence was so deep it pressed in on you, making the smallest sound feel amplified. But even as I continued my rounds, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, lurking in the dark corners of the halls. The next few nights, things only got worse. At first, it was just small movements I caught in the corner of my eye, shadows flickering as if something had passed behind me. Whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. I would check the cameras in the security room, but the footage always showed the same empty halls, silent and undisturbed. Still, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong. One night, while standing in front of an ancient display case, I noticed the faintest impression on the dusty floor, like the outline of a footprint. I bent down to inspect it, running my finger over the surface. The impression was fresh, but no one else had been in the room. I stood up quickly, feeling a chill run down my spine. My thoughts wandered back to those old legends, the ones that warned of curses placed on those who disturbed the tombs of the pharaohs. I had laughed when I heard those stories, but now I wasn't so sure. A few days later, I encountered something I couldn't ignore. It was late, well past midnight. I had just finished a patrol of the lower levels and was making my way back up to the main exhibit hall when I heard it again. This time it was louder, clearer. A whisper, low and guttural, but unmistakably there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I froze, holding my breath. The whisper seemed to float out of the shadows near the Tutankhamun exhibit, where the boy king's golden mask gleamed beneath the glass case. I wasn't sure if it was the trick of the acoustics or if the sound was truly coming from that direction, but every instinct in me told me to leave, to walk away and forget it. But I couldn't. Against my better judgment, I stepped closer. That's when I noticed something that sent a jolt of fear through me. The glass on the display case was smudged. Not just a little either. It looked as if someone had pressed their hand against it. I shone my flashlight onto the glass, and there, in the dust, was the outline of a human hand. The museum was locked at night. There was no way anyone could have been in there. No visitors, no staff, just me. I took a step back, my pulse hammering in my ears. I glanced around, suddenly feeling the weight of the ancient statues and relics bearing down on me. There was a suffocating stillness in the air, like the building itself was holding its breath. I wanted to run, to get out of there, but my feet felt rooted to the floor. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. One of the statues, one of the tall, imposing figures of Anubis, the jackal-headed god, seemed to sway just slightly as if something had passed by it. I blinked, telling myself it was impossible. The statues were massive, unmoving stone, but the shadows around it seemed to thicken, pulling inward, swirling like a dark fog. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight, the beam cutting erratically through the room. And then I heard the whisper again, closer this time, almost right beside me. I could feel the cold breath of it against my ear, a language I didn't understand, but it felt ancient, filled with malice. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I was back in the security office, slamming the door shut behind me. My heart pounded in my chest as I frantically pulled up the security footage. I scanned the cameras, looking for any sign of what I had just seen, but the feeds were normal, just empty rooms, motionless statues, and silent displays. I sat there for a long time, staring at the screens, trying to convince myself that it had been nothing but my imagination. But deep down, I knew something was wrong, something ancient, something powerful. The next few nights were worse. More shadows, more strange movements. I began to notice symbols appearing on the walls, drawn faintly in the dust, hieroglyphs I didn't recognize, but they felt threatening. They looked like warnings, etched by unseen hands, slowly growing clearer each time I passed through the halls. And there was always that whisper following me, growing more insistent, more hostile. I had started to dream of the pharaohs. In my sleep, I was transported to the burial chambers, standing before the sarcophagi, while unseen hands began to seal me inside. I would wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, the feeling of suffocation lingering long after the dream had ended. Then, one night, I saw it. The thing that made me finally believe in the curse. It was close to 3 a.m., and I was in the pharaonic hall again, making my rounds. The air was heavy, almost oppressive, and the shadows seemed thicker than usual. As I passed by one of the display cases, I heard the faint sound of scraping, like stone being dragged across the floor. I turned, slowly, my heart racing. In the dim light, I saw it. One of the sarcophagi had shifted. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but I could see the lid had moved, just a crack, enough to reveal the black void inside. I stared, frozen, unable to move, as the lid shifted again, this time opening wider, with a low, grinding sound. My breath caught in my throat as a hand, wrapped in ancient, decayed linen, slowly emerged from the darkness. I took a step back, my entire body trembling with fear. This couldn't be happening. It wasn't possible. But there it was, an ancient, withered hand, reaching out of the sarcophagus, its fingers curling as if trying to grasp the air. The smell of old, dry decay filled the room, a scent of death that had been undisturbed for thousands of years. I stumbled backward, my flashlight shaking in my hand as the lid of the sarcophagus continued to open. The whispers grew louder now, filling the room, voices speaking in a language older than time itself, voices that seemed to rise from the very depths of the tomb. And then I saw it, emerging slowly from the sarcophagus, a figure, tall and draped in tattered bandages, its face hidden in shadow. But I could feel its eyes on me, cold, empty, ancient. It took a step toward me, and I ran. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I was out of the museum, gasping for breath in the cold night air. My mind was spinning, my heart racing, but I knew one thing for sure. The curse was real. The pharaohs were angry. I quit the next morning, leaving without a word to anyone. I couldn't stay in that place, not after what I had seen. I had disturbed something that was never meant to be disturbed, and now I could feel the weight of it following me, even after I left the museum. Sometimes at night I still hear the whispers, and when I close my eyes, I see the hieroglyphs, glowing faintly in the darkness, warning me that the curse is not done with me yet. But leaving the museum didn't free me from the nightmare. If anything, it followed me more closely. In the weeks that passed after I quit, I thought I could escape it, distance myself from the terrifying experiences I had at the museum, shake off the feeling that something had attached itself to me, like a dark shadow clinging to my life. But the curse wasn't tied to the museum, it was tied to me. At first, it was subtle. My nights were filled with those same unsettling dreams of tombs closing in on me, of being sealed inside with the mummified remains of ancient pharaohs. But I could brush those off as nightmares, disturbing but explainable. Then small things began happening. Objects in my apartment would shift slightly from where I left them. My phone, my keys, little things like that. I started hearing faint scraping sounds in the middle of the night, as if something or someone was dragging its fingers along the walls of my bedroom. I thought it was just paranoia. After all, the mind plays tricks after trauma. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. One night, as I sat in my small apartment in the heart of Cairo, trying to distract myself with the sound of the city outside, I noticed something strange. A mark, faint but visible, was scratched into the wooden surface of my kitchen table. A symbol. At first glance, it looked like a random scratch, but as I looked closer, a chill washed over me. It was a hieroglyph, a symbol I didn't recognize, but it seemed familiar. I had seen it in the museum, somewhere on the ancient relics or scrolls, but I couldn't place where. The sight of it made my heart race. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing. I must have scratched the table without realizing it, I thought, or maybe it had been there for a while, and I hadn't noticed. But the next night, there were more symbols. They appeared in odd places, on the windowsill, on the frame of the bathroom mirror, even etched faintly into the plaster above my bed. Always the same strange, ancient symbols, and then the shadows returned. I would catch glimpses of them moving in the corners of my vision, dark, elongated figures that would disappear as soon as I turned my head. Sometimes they seemed to take shape, like the jackal-headed statues I had seen in the museum. At other times, they were just masses of darkness, shifting and swirling like smoke. But the worst part was the whispers. They followed me wherever I went. In the still of the night, they would grow louder, hissing ancient words I didn't understand, filling my apartment with a sense of cold dread. I tried turning on the TV, playing music, anything to drown out the sound, but nothing worked. The whispers were always there, just at the edge of my hearing, like they were waiting for me to acknowledge them. I started avoiding the apartment, spending more time wandering the busy streets of Cairo, trying to lose myself in the noise and chaos of the city. But even there, I couldn't escape. In the crowds, I would see familiar faces, faces that seemed out of place, too old, too pale, as if they were watching me from across the centuries. In the reflective glass of storefronts, I would catch a glimpse of the same symbols scratched faintly into the walls. And always, in the back of my mind, I felt the presence of something ancient, something that had followed me from the tombs of the pharaohs, growing closer. One evening, as the sun was setting and the streets began to empty, I found myself standing near the Khan el-Khalili Bazaar, one of Cairo's oldest markets. The air was thick with the smell of spices, incense, and smoke from the food stalls. I was trying to clear my head when I felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. My skin prickled and I turned quickly, scanning the crowd. For a moment I saw nothing out of the ordinary, just people going about their lives. But then, I saw it. Standing at the far end of the street, partially hidden in the shadows of an alley, was a figure. Tall, thin, and draped in ancient, tattered linen. It was the same figure I had seen in the museum. The same figure that had risen from the sarcophagus, with its cold, empty eyes staring directly at me. My heart seized in my chest, and I took a step back, blinking, hoping that what I was seeing was just a trick of the light. But when I looked again, it was still there, and it was moving toward me slowly, deliberately, with a kind of predatory grace. I turned and ran. I didn't care where, I just needed to get away. I pushed through the narrow streets, weaving between stalls and vendors, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But no matter how fast I ran, I could feel it closing in. The shadows seemed to bend around me, following me through the labyrinth of the market. I didn't stop running until I reached my apartment, slamming the door shut behind me, my chest burning from the effort. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath, but the room felt stifling, like the air had been sucked out. And then I heard it, the soft rustle of linen, like something shifting in the dark. I flicked on the lights, my heart hammering in my chest. The apartment was empty, but I could feel it. Something was there, something unseen. I moved cautiously through the rooms, checking every corner, every shadow. But as I stepped into the bedroom, I froze. Etched into the wall above my bed, glowing faintly in the dim light, was the same hieroglyph I had seen before. But now it was larger, more intricate, and beneath it, in smaller script, was a message. I didn't know how I understood it, but the meaning was clear. The curse is upon you. The next morning, I decided I had to do something. I couldn't keep running. Whatever had been awakened was not going to leave me alone. I needed answers. I reached out to a friend of mine, an Egyptologist who worked at the university. His name was Dr. Mahmoud, and I had always known him to be a skeptic. Someone who dismissed the idea of curses as superstitious nonsense. But when I explained what had been happening to me, his tone changed. "Meet me," he said, his voice unusually tense. "There is something you need to see." I met him at the university later that afternoon. His office was cluttered with books and scrolls, and as I sat down, he pulled out an old, tattered manuscript. He flipped through the brittle pages until he found what he was looking for, an illustration of the same hieroglyph I had seen in my apartment. "This," he said, tapping the page, "is the symbol of an ancient curse. It was used in rare instances when a tomb was desecrated or when the spirit of the dead was disturbed. The curse binds itself to the intruder, following them wherever they go. It doesn't stop until..." "Until what?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Mahmoud looked at me grimly. "Until it takes you." My stomach turned. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I had disturbed something. I had awakened something ancient and vengeful. "There must be a way to stop it," I said, my voice trembling with desperation. Mahmoud hesitated, flipping through the manuscript again. "There might be, but the rituals required are dangerous, and even if we could attempt them, the curse is unpredictable. Ancient spirits are not easily placated." I sat there in silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on me. This curse wasn't something I could outrun. It wasn't something I could ignore. The shadows, the whispers, the moving figures, they weren't just my imagination. They were real, and they were coming for me. That night, as I lay in bed, I knew what was coming. I could feel the air growing colder, the darkness thickening around me. The whispers were louder now, closer, filling the room with their ancient, indecipherable words. And then, just before the lights flickered out, I saw it, the figure standing at the foot of my bed, wrapped in linen, its hollow eyes staring down at me, its hands slowly reaching out. This time, there was no escape. I didn't take the job at the old factory because it was a good one. In fact, no one in their right mind would have. The pay wasn't great, the hours were long, and it meant working alone, out in the middle of nowhere in Siberia where the cold seemed to creep into your bones and settle there. But I had my reasons. Jobs were scarce in the town, especially for someone like me. A night security guard wasn't exactly glamorous, but I figured it would be quiet. And quiet was what I needed. At least, that's what I thought at first. The factory itself was an old, hulking thing, abandoned for the better part of 2 decades, its purpose long forgotten. Most people in the town didn't talk about it much anymore, and those who did had little good to say. They spoke in hushed tones, mostly warning of the strange things that happened there when it was still operational. Accidents, workers disappearing. It had the kind of history you'd expect from a place like that, and I had heard enough local folklore to know that some people believed something still lingered in the factory. I didn't buy into that. I was practical. A factory is just concrete, steel, and machinery. There was nothing more to it. At least that's what I kept telling myself. I'd been working there for about a month, and at first the shifts were as dull as I expected. The factory was massive, stretching out over several acres of frozen ground, and my job was simple: walk the perimeter, check the interior, make sure no one had broken in or tampered with anything, and log any unusual occurrences. Unusual occurrences. The very phrase made me chuckle at first. What could possibly happen out here in the middle of nowhere? But over time, I started to notice things, subtle things. At first, it was just the sounds, faint, almost imperceptible. The kind you could write off as the building settling or the wind whistling through the broken windows. But these sounds were different. They didn't come from outside. They echoed through the halls, soft at first, like the scrape of metal or the shuffle of feet. It was enough to make me pause, but not enough to really make me worry. I brushed it off. It was probably just the old building. After all, this place was falling apart. Cracks ran through the walls, the floors creaked with every step, and the roof sagged in places. It didn't take much for an old factory like this to make noise. That's what I told myself anyway. But the noises kept coming. They grew louder, more frequent, and they seemed to move. I'd hear them in one hallway, then in another, always in the distance, always just out of reach. The longer I worked there, the more the silence became something I dreaded. When the factory was still, it felt too still, like the air was waiting for something to happen. And when the sounds came, they felt too deliberate. I started to feel like I wasn't alone in the building. I knew it was ridiculous, but the feeling grew stronger with each shift. Something was there, watching, waiting. One night, as I was making my rounds, I heard something different. It wasn't the usual creak or shuffle. This was something unmistakable, a faint whisper. It echoed down the long, empty corridor in front of me, so low and distorted that I couldn't make out any words, but it was there, a voice. My skin prickled as I stopped in my tracks, staring down the hallway, shining my flashlight into the darkness. Nothing. But the whisper had been real. I was sure of it. My pulse quickened, and for the first time, I felt a cold sweat break out despite the freezing temperature. I shook my head, telling myself it was nothing. Just the wind, maybe, or my own mind playing tricks on me after too many nights in the empty factory. I tried to laugh it off, but the sound felt hollow, too forced. I continued my patrol, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease. But it wasn't long before the sounds returned. This time, it was footsteps. Light, quick, and too small to belong to a person. They echoed through the factory, bouncing off the crumbling walls, making it impossible to tell where they were coming from. I spun around, my flashlight flickering as I tried to find the source, but the beam caught only empty space. I started moving faster, my boots clomping against the concrete floor as I walked toward the control room. A small space where I could sit, check the security cameras, and collect myself. But as I neared the door, I heard a noise that stopped me in my tracks. A laugh. It was soft, almost like a child's giggle, but twisted, wrong somehow. Like it came from something that didn't know how to laugh properly. The sound sent a chill down my spine. I didn't turn around. I didn't want to see whatever had made that sound. I rushed into the control room, slamming the door shut behind me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I locked the door and sat down, my heart hammering in my chest. I stared at the security monitors, my eyes scanning the grainy footage from the cameras stationed throughout the factory. Most of them were barely functioning, showing static or black screens, but a few still worked, though the images were flickering and distorted. For a few minutes, nothing happened. I watched the empty halls, the dilapidated machinery, the broken windows rattling in the wind. And then I saw it. Something moved on one of the screens, a shadow darting between the pillars in the main hall. It was quick, barely visible, but I knew I had seen it. I leaned in closer, trying to make out the shape, but the camera flickered and the shadow was gone. I switched to another camera, my hands shaking. This time, I caught a glimpse of it again, something small, humanoid, but twisted. The figure was crouched near one of the machines, too far away to make out any details, but its outline was unmistakable. It wasn't human. Suddenly, the screen went black. All the monitors blinked out at once, leaving me sitting in the dark, the only light coming from my flickering flashlight. My throat tightened, and I felt the weight of the silence pressing in on me. I didn't want to go back out there, but I knew I couldn't stay in the control room forever. I stood up, flashlight in hand, and unlocked the door, stepping back into the cold, empty hallway. The factory was silent again. No footsteps, no whispers, no laughter. But the air felt heavy, charged with a sense of something unseen, lurking just out of sight. My mind raced with memories of old Russian folklore, stories my grandmother used to tell me when I was a child, tales of the domovoi, house spirits that lived in the corners of homes, watching over the family. They were supposed to be mischievous, yes, but also protective. That is, unless you angered them. I had never believed in those stories before. They were just old tales meant to scare kids into behaving. But now, standing in the middle of this decaying factory, I couldn't shake the thought. What if the domovoi wasn't just a spirit of the home? What if something had been left behind in this place? Something that had twisted and rotted, like the factory itself. As I moved deeper into the factory, I began to notice small things that I hadn't before. Tools that had been left out on the floor were now neatly arranged on tables. Doors I had locked were now open, swinging gently in the cold breeze that filtered through the cracks in the walls. It was as if something had been tidying up the place, organizing it in a way that made no sense. And then I saw it. Down one of the long corridors, illuminated by the weak beam of my flashlight, was a small figure. At first, it looked like a child, crouched down, its back to me. But as I approached, my heart pounding in my chest, I realized that it wasn't a child. Its limbs were too long, its body too thin. The skin was a pale, sickly gray, and the clothes it wore were tattered rags, hanging loosely off its bony frame. It didn't move. It just sat there, its head tilted slightly to the side, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. I stopped, frozen in place, the air in my lungs suddenly feeling too thin. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I stood there, staring at the creature, unable to tear my eyes away. And then, slowly, it turned its head. The face that looked back at me wasn't human. It was something far older, far darker. Its eyes were black pits, empty and soulless, and its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. I stumbled back, my heart racing as the thing let out a low, guttural growl. The sound reverberated through the corridor, vibrating in my chest, and I turned and ran. They weren't just content to move objects or cause harmless trouble. They would torment anyone who disturbed their territory, sometimes driving them mad, or worse. The more I read, the more the pieces began to fit together. The factory had been abandoned for years. It had once been a place of work, of people and purpose. But now it was a hollow shell, filled with nothing but rust and decay. What if something had lingered there after the workers had left? What if, over time, whatever spirit had remained had grown bitter, twisted by the isolation? I couldn't shake the thought. The domovoi, once a protective spirit, could have turned into something far darker. What if that's what I had encountered? A malevolent spirit, angered by the years of neglect, twisted into a form that no longer resembled the helpful creatures of the old stories. That creature I saw, with its long limbs and dark, hollow eyes, it wasn't a house spirit anymore. It had become something else. But why had it appeared to me? I hadn't disturbed anything. Or had I? I thought back to the first weeks I had spent in the factory. I'd been careless, walking through the halls without a second thought, barely even registering the history of the place. I had ignored the warnings, brushed off the strange occurrences. Maybe that was enough. Maybe my presence alone was an offense, a reminder to whatever was still there that it had been forgotten for too long. The realization settled in like a cold stone in my stomach. I hadn't just stumbled into a haunted place, I had angered something. And now it was too late to make amends. In the weeks that followed, my paranoia grew. I avoided the factory at all costs, but the fear stayed with me. It was always in the back of my mind, like a shadow I couldn't escape. Even in my new apartment, miles away from the factory, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. Sometimes at night, I'd hear faint noises, scratching at the walls, whispers that sounded like they were coming from just outside the window. And once, just before dawn, I woke to the soft, unmistakable sound of laughter. The same laughter from the factory. That was when I knew, this thing, whatever it was, wasn't tied to the factory anymore. It was tied to me. I stopped sleeping after that. Or, at least I tried to. But exhaustion has a way of pulling you under, no matter how hard you fight it. I'd wake up in strange places, once on the floor by the front door, another time sitting in the chair by the window, staring out at the street as if I'd been waiting for something. My mind felt fractured, like I was constantly drifting between dreams and reality. I couldn't live like that. I knew that much. So, I made the decision to leave again. This time, I'd go farther, somewhere remote, even more isolated. Maybe if I put enough distance between myself and the factory, the thing would lose interest. Maybe it would forget me. Or maybe I would finally understand what it wanted. On my last night in town, I packed my bags, trying to stay calm. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt the familiar sense of dread wash over me. The air grew thick, heavy with the weight of something unseen. I moved quickly, trying not to think about the strange prickling at the back of my neck, or the way the shadows seemed to stretch and move in the dim light. As I zipped up my last bag, I heard it. A soft shuffle of feet, followed by a low, familiar laugh. It was in the room. I turned, my heart hammering in my chest, and saw it standing there in the doorway. The same twisted figure from the factory, crouched low, its dark eyes staring at me with that same grotesque grin. It hadn't stayed behind, it had followed me. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I just stood there, staring back at it, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, none of which made sense. Then slowly, it raised one long, spindly finger and pointed directly at me. The room grew colder, and for the first time I understood. It wasn't finished with me, and I knew deep down that it never would be. It was a cold, biting night, typical of late autumn in the west of Ireland. The wind howled through the rolling hills, carrying with it the scent of rain and the sea. Owen stood at the entrance of the old castle, rubbing his hands together in a futile attempt to stay warm. His breath hung in the air, turning to mist in the freezing air as he surveyed the vast, desolate landscape that stretched out before him. The village below was barely visible through the thick fog that clung to the ground like a shroud. He had never been the superstitious type, but even he couldn't deny the unease that crept over him whenever he set foot in this place. The castle, Caisleanafola, they called it, Castle of Blood, had stood abandoned for centuries, crumbling under the weight of time. The locals whispered about it, always in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously to the ground as if afraid of being overheard by something unseen. They spoke of the Bean Sea, the Banshee, whose mournful wails were said to herald death. They spoke of the castle's dark history, of bloodshed, betrayal, and curses that lingered long after the stones had begun to crumble. Owen had heard the stories, of course, but he didn't put much stock in them. Folklore was for the old-timers, the ones who still left out bowls of milk for the Fae and refused to walk past graveyards after sunset. He, on the other hand, was a man of the modern world, and the job was just that, a job. It wasn't his first night watch assignment, and it wouldn't be his last. Still, as he stood in the shadow of those towering stone walls, even he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. The wind picked up, sending a shiver down his spine as it swept through the empty corridors of the castle. He tugged his jacket tighter around his shoulders and turned on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. His footsteps echoed on the cobblestones as he made his way through the courtyard, the only sound in the otherwise deathly quiet night. The air here felt different, thicker somehow, as though it carried with it the weight of something ancient, something waiting. He reached the great hall, its once grand interior now a ruin of collapsed ceilings and rotting beams. Moss covered the stone walls, and the floor was strewn with debris from centuries of neglect. Owen's boots crunched over broken shards of glass as he walked, the sound unnervingly loud in the silence. He scanned the room, his flashlight sweeping over the decayed remnants of what had once been a banquet hall. Faded tapestries hung limply from the walls, their patterns long since worn away by time. A large fireplace dominated one wall, cold and empty, its mantel carved with intricate designs that were almost unrecognizable beneath the layers of grime. Something about the place felt off tonight. It wasn't just the cold or the isolation. There was an electricity in the air, a tension that made the hairs on the back of Owen's neck stand on end. He paused in front of the fireplace, shining his light into the deep, dark recesses of the hearth. The beam flickered, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw something, a shadow, quick and fleeting, dart across the far wall. His pulse quickened, but when he swept the light back again, there was nothing. Just the wind, he muttered under his breath, his voice sounding small and hollow in the vast room. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. As the night wore on, the wind outside grew fiercer, rattling the loose stones and sending a low, mournful howl through the castle's corridors. Owen made his way up the narrow, spiral staircase that led to the tower. The steps were uneven, worn smooth from centuries of use, and he had to grip the cold stone wall for balance as he climbed. His legs ached by the time he reached the top, but the view from the tower made it worth the effort. The village below was little more than a scattering of dim lights, the fog thickening as it rolled in from the sea. The wind gusted against the tower, and Owen pulled his jacket tighter, watching the clouds race across the sky. But something else caught his eye. Something moving, far out in the fields beyond the village. At first he thought it was just the mist, swirling in strange patterns as the wind swept over the land. But as he stared harder, a shape began to emerge. It was indistinct, like a shadow at the edge of his vision, but it was there, moving. A figure, gliding slowly across the fields. Owen blinked, straining to see more clearly. The figure was pale, almost ghostly, with long, flowing hair that fluttered in the wind. His heart began to pound in his chest. It couldn't be. It wasn't possible. The banshee. The stories came flooding back to him, stories he had dismissed as old wives' tales. But there she was, as clear as day, or night, rather. The beam, the harbinger of death. Her wailing cry would follow soon, he knew, a sound that had driven him mad with fear. The villagers had warned him, begged him not to take the night watch job at the castle, but he had laughed it off, waved away their concerns. Now standing in the tower with the figure moving ever closer, he wasn't laughing. He tore his gaze from the window, his pulse racing as he descended the spiral stairs 2 steps at a time. His flashlight flickered again as he reached the base of the tower, and the wind howled through the cracks in the stone walls, sounding eerily like a voice. A cold, feminine voice, wailing in the distance. The first cry was faint, barely audible over the howling wind, but it sent a chill through Owen's bones. It was a high-pitched, mournful wail, the sound of a woman weeping in anguish. He froze in place, his heart hammering in his chest. There was no mistaking it now. The banshee was here. Owen's hand shook as he fumbled for the radio on his belt, but his fingers felt numb, useless. The air was thick with tension, so heavy it felt like he was trying to move through water. Another wail echoed through the castle, louder this time, closer. His flashlight flickered and went out completely, plunging him into darkness. Panic surged through him as he stumbled blindly through the great hall, the wails growing louder, more insistent. He needed to get out, now. As he reached the main entrance, something cold brushed against the back of his neck, sending an icy shiver down his spine. He whipped around, but there was nothing there, just shadows. His breath came in ragged gasps as he fumbled with the latch on the door, his hands trembling uncontrollably. It wouldn't budge. The wailing was deafening now, filling the castle with its mournful cry. Owen's heart pounded in his ears as he fought with the door, his mind racing. It's just a story, he tried to tell himself, just an old legend. It can't be real. But the banshee's cries told him otherwise. And then, in the midst of the wailing, came a voice. Soft, cold, and undeniably real. Owen. His blood ran cold. It was his name, whispered, spoken with the kind of certainty that chilled him to the bone. He turned slowly, his back pressed against the heavy wooden door. The figure from the fields was standing in the center of the great hall now, her pale face illuminated by the dim light filtering through the cracks in the walls. Her long white hair blew in an unseen wind, and her eyes, dark and hollow, were fixed on him. Owen. Her voice was soft, barely above a whisper, but it carried with it the weight of centuries, of death. She raised a hand, skeletal and pale, beckoning him forward. He couldn't move. His legs felt rooted to the spot, his body frozen in fear. The banshee's wails filled his ears, drowning out all other sound, and the air grew colder still. He could feel her presence now, ancient, terrible, and unrelenting. The weight of it pressed down on him, suffocating, as if the castle itself were closing in around him. Owen, she called again, her voice echoing in his mind. He couldn't run. He couldn't hide. The banshee's cry was an omen of death, and there was no escaping it. As the darkness closed in, Owen knew, with a sinking certainty, that she hadn't come to warn him. She had come for him. The banshee's eyes seemed to pierce through him, and with every second that passed, Owen felt a weight pressing down on him. It wasn't just the fear that gripped him, it was something deeper, something ancient that had waited for this moment. The air inside the castle felt heavy, oppressive, as though the centuries of death and darkness had congealed into a living presence. Owen forced his legs to move, stumbling back from the ghostly figure as it began to glide toward him. Each step felt like he was wading through thick, freezing water. His breath came in shallow gasps, and his vision blurred as panic took over. He could barely hear his own footsteps over the banshee's wails, which had now grown into an unearthly chorus that echoed through the crumbling hallways. Please. Owen's voice cracked, barely audible as he pleaded with the figure. But he knew there was no mercy in the banshee's eyes. There never had been, not in the stories, not in the countless deaths her cries had foretold. With a last desperate effort, he turned and ran toward the narrow passage that led to the castle's side exit. His boots skidded on the slick stones as he fought to stay upright, but the banshee's presence was everywhere. He could feel her icy breath on the back of his neck, the echo of her cries rattling through his skull. The walls themselves seemed to close in on him as if the castle had come alive, were eager to swallow him whole. But as Owen reached the doorway, the cold wind slammed it shut with a thunderous crash. He yanked at the handle, but the door wouldn't budge. He was trapped. The banshee's wail intensified, rising to a crescendo that rattled the very stones of the castle. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the wailing stopped. Silence fell over the castle like a thick blanket, leaving only the sound of Owen's ragged breathing. He turned slowly, fear twisting in his gut. The banshee stood before him, inches away now, her pale, gaunt face illuminated by the faint light seeping through the cracks in the walls. Her hollow eyes were locked onto his, and for a moment, everything else faded into the background. The world outside, the wind, the storm, none of it mattered. All that existed was Owen and the banshee. Owen, she whispered one last time, her voice soft yet filled with the weight of death. He felt his heart skip a beat, his chest tightening with a sudden, unbearable pressure. It was as though invisible hands were squeezing the life out of him. His vision swam, dark spots dancing in the corners of his eyes. He could feel it now, death's cold grip tightening around his heart, pulling him closer to the abyss. His legs buckled, and he collapsed to the ground, gasping for air as the banshee's cold presence washed over him. She bent down slowly, her skeletal hand reaching out to touch his cheek. The moment her fingers brushed his skin, a wave of icy numbness spread through his body, paralyzing him. The last thing he saw before the darkness claimed him was her face, twisted into a mournful smile, her hollow eyes filled with an ancient, sorrowful knowledge. When Owen awoke, he was no longer in the castle. He found himself lying in a small, cold room with bare stone walls. The only light came from a small oil lamp flickering in the corner. His body ached, and his head throbbed with a dull, persistent pain. Slowly, he sat up, trying to piece together what had happened. Had it all been a dream? But as he looked around the room, he realized he wasn't alone. A figure sat in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the lamplight. An old man, his face lined with age, stared at Owen with cold, knowing eyes. "You've seen her, haven't you?" The man's voice was raspy but steady. "The bean sea." Owen didn't answer. His throat felt too dry, too raw to form words. The man leaned forward, his face now visible in the dim light. "The banshee, she only comes for those tied to this place. This castle, it holds more than just the memories of the dead. It holds a curse." Owen's mind raced as the old man spoke. He had heard rumors about the castle, tales whispered in the village pubs late at night, but he had always dismissed them. Kaislan-Nafola had been the site of a bloody massacre centuries ago, a betrayal that had sealed the fates of the noble family who had lived there. Legend had it that the lord of the castle had been cursed by a spurned lover, a woman who had died in the tower, her heart broken, her spirit bound to the land. "The castle, it's alive in a way," the old man continued. "It feeds on the fear of those who enter. And the banshee, she's its guardian. She watches, she waits, and when the time is right, she comes." Owen's heart pounded in his chest. The banshee's cries still echoed in his mind, and the memory of her cold touch sent shivers down his spine. "You weren't meant to be here," the old man said, his voice heavy with regret. "But now that she's seen you, she won't let go." Owen's stomach twisted with dread. "What do you mean?" he croaked, finally finding his voice. The old man's gaze softened, but there was no comfort in his words. "She's marked you, lad. The banshee, she's an omen of death. And once she's marked you, there's no escaping it." Owen's breath caught in his throat. "But you'll be lucky if you last the week," the old man interrupted, shaking his head. "The others, they never did." The weight of the man's words sank in, and Owen felt a cold, creeping fear settle over him. He had heard of the banshee's mark, an invisible curse that clung to its victim, drawing them closer to death with each passing day. It was said that once the banshee's wails had been heard, death would soon follow. Owen stood abruptly, his legs shaky beneath him. "There has to be a way out of this," he said, his voice wavering. "There has to be." The old man remained silent for a long moment before finally speaking. "There is one way, but it's a dangerous path." Owen's eyes widened, desperate for any glimmer of hope. "What is it?" The man sighed, rubbing his temples. "You have to confront her, lad. You have to face the banshee herself." A lump formed in Owen's throat as the old man's words sunk in. Face the banshee. The very idea filled him with a terror so deep it left him frozen. But deep down, he knew there was no other choice. "What do I have to do?" Owen asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The old man stood, his movements slow and deliberate. "There's a place," he said. "A shrine, hidden in the hills behind the castle. The old ones used to leave offerings there, hoping to appease the spirit. You must go there, alone, and offer her a token. But beware, she may not accept it." Owen felt a chill run down his spine. The weight of the task was clear, and the danger was undeniable. But what choice did he have? The next night, Owen made his way through the thick, fog-covered hills behind Kaislan-Nafola. The wind howled through the trees, and the ground was slick with rain, making the trek treacherous. Every step felt like a struggle, as if the very earth was trying to hold him back. At last he reached the shrine, a small, crumbling stone circle hidden in a grove of ancient oaks. The air here was thick with the scent of decay, and a strange stillness hung over the place, as though even the wind dared not disturb it. Owen knelt before the shrine, his heart pounding in his chest. He pulled a small silver cross from his pocket, a family heirloom passed down through generations, and placed it gently on the stone. "Please," he whispered, his voice trembling, "let this be enough." For a long moment, nothing happened. The wind died down, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, from the darkness, came the banshee's wail. It started low, barely more than a whisper, but it quickly grew into a deafening scream that pierced the night air. Owen's blood ran cold as the banshee appeared, gliding toward him from the shadows. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, and her long, white hair whipped wildly around her as she approached the shrine. Javier had always preferred the night shift. In a city as vast and sprawling as Mexico City, the quiet of the night offered a reprieve from the frenetic chaos of the day. The hospital where he worked as a security guard sat at the edge of the city, nestled between crumbling colonial buildings and modern high-rises. By day, it was teeming with life. Doctors, nurses, patients, and visitors flooding its narrow hallways. But by night, it was a different world, a quieter, darker one. The hospital was an old structure, parts of it dating back nearly a century. It had seen countless renovations, yet there were still corners untouched by time. Rooms no longer in use, corridors that led to nowhere, and a basement morgue that hadn't been operational in decades. Javier often found himself drawn to these forgotten areas, his rounds taking him through shadowy hallways that most of the staff avoided. He told himself it was simply out of duty, but in truth, he enjoyed the eerie stillness. On this particular night, the air felt heavier than usual. There was a thick humidity to it, even indoors, and the buzzing of the fluorescent lights in the hallway seemed louder, more pronounced. Javier finished his coffee, tossed the cup in a nearby trash can, and adjusted his belt. Midnight had come and gone, and the hospital was asleep. Or so he thought. As he began his usual round through the empty wings, a subtle unease crept over him. It started as a chill, a faint prickling at the back of his neck. Javier shrugged it off and continued, his flashlight cutting through the dimly lit hallways. The sound of his boots against the floor echoed around him, a lonely rhythm in the vast, hollow space. But there was something else, something just beyond the edge of his hearing, a soft, indistinct noise, like whispering. He paused, frowning, and tilted his head to listen. The sound disappeared. Javier shook his head, laughing softly to himself. "You're tired, that's all," he thought. The graveyard shift could play tricks on your mind if you weren't careful. He'd seen it happen to other guards before, men who swore they'd seen shadows move, heard voices in the dead of night. But it was always exhaustion, nothing more. Still, the hospital felt different tonight. He moved past the empty reception desk and into the main corridor, where the older wings of the hospital stretched out in long, dark rows. These were parts of the building that had long been closed off, unused rooms with peeling wallpaper, broken windows, and the stench of decay that clung to the air. They didn't make sense to be part of his rounds, but Javier always felt an odd pull towards them. He couldn't explain it. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something else. As he turned the corner into one of the older hallways, his flashlight flickered. Javier tapped it against his palm, muttering a curse under his breath. The light steadied again, but the flicker had unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. He passed by room 306, a room that had been locked and sealed for as long as anyone could remember. Its windows were dark, the door marked with a fading sign that read "No Entry." Javier paused for a moment, staring at the door. For years, rumors had swirled around the room, whispers of strange happenings, unexplainable deaths, and shadows seen moving behind the curtains. The hospital staff didn't speak of it openly, but everyone knew the stories. As he stood there, the hairs on the back of his neck rose again. This time it was unmistakable. He wasn't alone. The temperature in the hallway had dropped noticeably, and a faint scent filled the air, something sweet and musky, like incense or flowers. It was the kind of scent used in offerings, the kind laid at the feet of La Santa Muerte. Javier's heart skipped a beat. His grandmother had always warned him about La Santa Muerte, the skeletal figure of death worshipped by many in Mexico. Though his grandmother revered her, praying for protection and blessings, Javier had always been wary. The idea of courting death, even in the form of a saint, made him uncomfortable. He took a step back from room 306, his mouth dry. Suddenly, the soft whispering returned, closer this time, more distinct. It wasn't words exactly, but the sound of someone or something just out of sight. His eyes darted down the hallway, but the beam of his flashlight showed nothing except dust and darkness. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it. A shadow, moving swiftly across the wall, almost too fast to catch. It was there for less than a second, but it was enough. Javier's pulse quickened. He wasn't imagining this. Someone was there. "¿Quién está ahí?" he called out, his voice firm, though his heart raced in his chest. No answer, just the whispering, growing louder, surrounding him. He took a step back, his hand instinctively going to the radio at his waist. But before he could call for backup, the lights in the hallway flickered and went out completely, plunging him into darkness. Javier cursed under his breath and raised his flashlight, but the beam barely pierced the blackness now, its flickering light weak and erratic. The air around him grew colder still, and the scent of incense grew stronger, almost suffocating. Then he heard it, a soft, slow scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. It came from behind him, from the direction of room 306. His heart thundered in his chest as he turned around, shining his light down the hallway. The door to room 306, which had been closed for as long as anyone could remember, was now ajar. A faint light glowed from within, a sickly yellow hue that sent a chill straight to Javier's bones. Akira had always been the last one to leave the office. Nestled in the heart of Akihabara, a neighborhood in Tokyo known more for its bustling electronics stores and anime shops than corporate high-rises, his office building was an anomaly, an old 12-story structure that had seen better days. The faded sign outside still bore the logo of a company that had long since gone bankrupt. Yet the building had been repurposed and now housed several businesses, including the advertising agency where Akira worked. Tonight, like many other nights, the hands of the wall clock crept past 10:30 p.m., the hum of the fluorescent lights above beginning to grate on his nerves. His colleagues had all left hours ago, their hurried goodbyes still lingering in the air. The office, once filled with the steady drone of keyboards and soft murmurs of phone conversations, had fallen silent. Too silent. Akira shook his head, forcing himself to refocus on the task at hand. He was preparing a marketing proposal for a client meeting the next day, and the deadline had caught up with him faster than he'd expected. The numbers on the screen blurred for a moment, and he rubbed his eyes, exhaustion taking its toll. The only sound was the rhythmic tapping of his fingers against the keyboard, broken by the occasional hiss of the air conditioner. But then, amidst the mechanical whirring, Akira thought he heard something else. It was faint, almost imperceptible, like a distant whisper. He paused, his fingers hovering above the keys, listening. The whispering had stopped. Shaking his head, he let out a tired laugh. "It's just your mind playing tricks on you," he told himself. After all, staying late at the office wasn't new to him. The long hours, the isolation, they had a way of messing with your senses. But as he resumed typing, the whispers returned. This time, they were a little louder. He stopped again, his pulse quickening. Slowly, he rose from his chair and scanned the room. The rows of cubicles stretched out in front of him, each one dark and empty. No sign of anyone, no sign of anything, for that matter. Just the darkness. "Is someone there?" he called out, his voice sounding small in the cavernous room. Nothing, only silence. Akira felt a chill crawl down his spine. His office building was old, sure, but it wasn't supposed to be haunted. Still, there were rumors. His co-workers liked to joke about it, stories of strange occurrences after hours, things moving by themselves, unexplained noises. One of his colleagues, a woman from the HR department, had once mentioned something about a ghost, an old urban legend involving an office worker who had died tragically late at night. He had laughed it off at the time, dismissing it as nothing more than an eerie bedtime story. But now, standing alone in the darkened office, the story resurfaced in his mind. Suddenly, there was a creak from one of the cubicles to his left. Akira froze, his breath catching in his throat. His eyes darted towards the source of the noise. For a moment, nothing seemed out of place. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement, a slight shifting, almost imperceptible, but enough to set his heart racing. The cubicle divider wobbled slightly, as if someone had brushed past it. Akira swallowed hard and stepped forward. His shoes squeaked against the linoleum floor, the sound amplified in the stillness of the office. He reached the cubicle and peered around the corner. Empty. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Get it together," he muttered to himself, turning to go back to his desk. But then, just as he turned, the whispers started again. This time they were clearer, closer. Akira's body stiffened. It felt as if the voices were right behind him, murmuring incoherent words just beyond his understanding. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead. His hands trembled as he grabbed his phone from the desk, glancing at the time. 10:45 p.m. Too late. Far too late. He tried to ignore it, forcing himself to focus on his work. Just finish the report, he thought. You're almost done. But the whispers wouldn't stop. They grew louder with each passing minute, weaving themselves into the hum of the air conditioning, threading through the stillness of the office like invisible tendrils reaching out to him. Akira's breath came in shallow gasps as he glanced around the room, desperate to find the source of the sound. But no matter where he looked, there was nothing. Just the empty cubicles and the flickering fluorescent lights overhead. Suddenly, the lights flickered again and went out. The office plunged into darkness, leaving only the dim glow of his computer screen to light the space around him. Akira froze, panic gripping his chest. His eyes strained to adjust to the darkness, his fingers clutching the edge of his desk for support. And then from the blackness, a figure emerged. At first, it was just a shadow, a vague shape moving through the rows of cubicles. Akira's heart pounded in his ears as he watched it approach, slowly, deliberately. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if urging the figure on. His phone buzzed in his hand, startling him. He fumbled to unlock it, the bright screen temporarily blinding him. It was a message from a number he didn't recognize. Leave now. It's too late. Akira's blood ran cold. His gaze shot back to the figure, which had now stopped at the edge of the nearest cubicle. It was closer now. Close enough for him to make out the vague outline of a person, tall, gaunt, with dark, stringy hair hanging over their face. The whispers swirled around him, growing louder, more frantic. Without thinking, Akira bolted from his desk, the chair clattering to the floor behind him. He ran for the elevator, his footsteps echoing in the empty office. But as he reached the elevator doors, his heart sank. The power was out. The elevator wasn't working. Desperately, he turned and ran for the stairs, the sound of his footsteps swallowed by the oppressive silence. The whispers followed him, growing louder with each step. He pushed through the stairwell door and flew down the stairs, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The building seemed to stretch endlessly, each floor blending into the next as he descended. Finally, he reached the ground floor. He slammed through the exit door and stumbled into the cool night air, his heart racing. The streets of Akihabara were eerily quiet, the usual neon glow muted by the lateness of the hour. Akira glanced back at the building, half expecting to see the shadowy figure standing in one of the windows, watching him. But the windows were dark, the building looming silently above him. For a moment he stood there, panting, his mind racing. What had just happened? Was it real? Or had it been some kind of waking nightmare, a trick of his overworked, sleep-deprived brain? But as his phone buzzed again, his blood ran cold. The message was simple, chilling. You can't outrun it. Akira's eyes widened in horror as he felt a cold breath on the back of his neck. Slowly, trembling, he turned around. And there, standing just inches away, was the figure. The whispers stopped. The last thing he heard was a soft, breathy voice in his ear, whispering his name.